Programs, lessons, tips, tricks, I don't know, it's all for you. Thank you so much for joining me here today. In this series of tutorials, we're gonna recreate a shot I did for a recent project and take that right from concept all the way through to final compositing. So you'll have a complete shot and the entire workflow and pipeline in between. That's Cinema 4D,
xparticles,
Octane Render, After Effects, and it's all free in this tutorial series. Did I say it's all free? It's all free. I also have a Patreon page, and this is where I'm going to plug that. There you'll have access to this entire series end to end when the final episode is released. You'll also be able to download free Cinema 4D project files and After Effects project files if you'd like to follow along and try this out. All for the low price of
a cup of coffee.
And if you haven't already, be sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, all that bull, because you want to be ready and here when the next video in the series is released. So in this episode, we're going to pick up where we left off with JRMY. All right, now for the fun part, the xparticles simulation. So what we're actually doing here is I'm not going to have the chain dynamically interact with floating dust particulate in the air. Instead, what I'm going to use is the chain to act as an emitter for particles. And what I think what happens is it starts to look like, it does look like particles are moving off of the chain, but I guess the idea is that it's kind of brushing through that space and kind of kicking those off. In my final render here, you could see that there's quite a bit of particles shooting off of it like that. In the nature of the shot that I need for the piece I'm working on, I liked that stylistically, but what's beautiful about this is you can kind of play around with your emitter and figure out what the right amount is for you. So let's get started with that. And what we're gonna do is just kind of clean up our scene here a little bit. I'm just gonna bring like the setup on the bottom and there, just kind of cleaned up right there. And what we'll do is go into xparticles and I'm gonna start an xparticles system. I'm gonna jump right in with the full system rather than just like building it off of the emitter. And that's because we're gonna have a few different emitters ultimately in here, and I'll kind of show you how to organize those a little bit. So for this emitter, what I like to do first, go into the system, shut off our icon. Let's go into our emitter and go into our display. Just kind of click play, and we're seeing our emissions right there, which is lovely. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna go into our XP emitter. I'm gonna start with the display. Instead of dots, I'm gonna turn those to circles. That way they're a lot easier to see. They're huge.
He's huge!
What I'm gonna do though is to go into emission. I'm gonna go into object, and I'm gonna change my emitter shape from this rectangle that we're defaulting with. If I jump out of the camera here, you can see, go to frame default. You can see we're just using, you know, a pretty standard xparticles emitter, firing a whole bunch of particles. Don't want that. What I want to do is go to my emitter shape and go to object. And in object, I'm gonna drop my cloner in. And you can see right away what's gonna happen is I'm getting this beautiful, all these particles firing off of my emitter. So let's see what we can do about that. So what I'm gonna do is go into my emission, and I'm gonna, for starters, I'm gonna turn the radius of these particles way down. I'm gonna drop this down to like 30 right now. So actually, we'll leave that at 90. These are the fun little things you do when you're kind of working around. See what we got.
Burning the house down is not fun, no!
I'm just gonna let this keep playing. For starters, I'm gonna drop that birth rate down a lot. Let's go to like 20. Okay, cool. Some easier to work with. And I wanna get my radius down as well. And we're still seeing a lot going on right here. So I think what we want to do next is start to affect the speed of these particles, because these are really shooting off there, and it's looking like it's emitting particles rather than it's kind of running into it. So I played around with a speed around like 10 centimeters. And what you can see now is it's just kind of, they're just kind of displacing almost, as if they're like right there in the scene. They're just kind of like, they're getting shifted almost by the wind of the chain moving along. And that's what we're going for. So we're getting there, we're getting closer. But I think our particles are still very, very big. We're trying to create dust particles here, and these dust particles are, about the half of the size of our chain link. So let's get those down a lot smaller. I'm gonna go to like 0.1 and we'll reset that. And already it's, it's getting there. It's getting a lot closer. I'm gonna put a little variation on the particles of 0.1, full variation there. So we start to get a little bit more of an organic look and feel. And at this point, let's jump back into our camera. That's basically it. So what we're having these particles just kind of, just getting knocked off of wherever they were in space. That's the idea. That's the look we're going for. And the idea is this chain is moving so quickly through our scene that it's bringing like a wind with it, and it's just knocking those particles around a little bit. But right now they're falling off a little too organically. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go into xparticles, modifiers, and we can do this right in our system. And we're gonna go to control modifiers and we're gonna go into motion modifiers, and we're gonna go to turbulence. Already we're starting to see how that turbulence is working. And what I'm gonna do is actually shut off my cloner for now. So we're just dealing with our modifier. We'll jump out of this camera. And this will help us hone in the level of our modifier. So we can see right here, if we shut off our helix as well, this is really like, we're getting this big turbulent wave kind of effects right here. And we really want to scale that down because, again, we're dealing with dust. We're not dealing with like this huge simulation. So for starters, what I'm going to do is bring my scale down significantly. And this is going to scale down the amount of turbulent displacement, the displacement map that's moving around. We're scaling that down. What I also want to do though is scale down how much is being affected. And what we're going to do with that is we're going to bring down the strength. So I bring my strength down to about 2, and you can see how it's not quite moving as much right now. The other thing we're seeing is this is really kind of whipping around. And so I want to bring down the frequency of this to about 1/3. So it's not, I don't want it to happen as much. And then finally, my noise type is standard. I like to put that on curl. And you get more of this like curly, wispy kind of effect. And what we're looking at now is, it's still pretty intense. But let's see it in action with our whole chain. So we'll turn our helix and our cloner back on, reset our simulation. And I think that's about where I like it, because it's whipping through the scene. It's really kind of whipping those around. You can see us turning down our strength a little bit, maybe to like 1. Again, it's just that little tiny bit of displacement. That's just knocking this right off kilter. And that's really all we're going for. Now we're looking at our scene and we're saying, okay, great, we have dust particles kind of moving around, but because they're being emitted off of our chain, it doesn't really look like they're knocking dust particles off. It looks like they're being emitted. So what we need to do is add just an overall ambient dust particle. So what we're going to do with that, we're going to build another emitter. So we're going to go into, and what I'm going to do is call this emitter.chain. I'm also going to call this turbulence.chain. And what we're going to do is build a second emitter. We're going to create this emitter, and we're going to call this emitter.ambient. And with this emitter, we're going to jump out of our camera again. We go back into our frame default, and what I want to do is turn that toggle on because I want to see the entire field of view from my camera right here. Because like in Octane with a fog volume, I want to actually build a volume that particles are going to be sitting in, and I want that to be encompassed in the entire field of view of the camera. So what I'm gonna do is go back to my ambient emitter. I'm gonna jump into my display here. We're using green for our for these particles and also these, and I don't want those to show up as green because I want to see the different things that are being affected. So I'm going to change that to like a purple here. Change this to circle. I love operating off of a circle. They're just easier to see than just the dots. They give you a good sense of size and scale as well. That's also why I like it. And you can see right away that I'm emitting those, but my emitter type is not where I want it. So what I'm going to do is go into my object again. Instead of a rectangle, I'm going to go to a box. And what this is going to do is create this box that all my particles are going to emit from. So they're all, or within. So all my particles are emitting in there. And what I want is I want to emit particles over my entire scene. So I'm going to just build my box in a way that it takes up my entire scene. And what I'll do is I'll rotate this box. If I jump into my different views here, I can start to build the box in a way that it takes over my entire camera's view. And you don't have to go crazy big, because if we do this, what it's going to do is as soon as you set that first, as soon as you hit that first keyframe, it's going to generate all those particles. And you're going to be generating all these particles way outside your field of view that you actually need. So if you look at like an angle like this, you can see our field of view right here. And all we're going to do is just kind of move this stuff around in a way that we're taking over just what we need to take over. Now this is getting a little confusing here because of our camera angle, but we're just going to kind of play with that there. Then what we can do is we just hit our next frame, and that'll generate our particles. And so now we have all these particles. We can shut this back off. So we have all these particles in this field of view, and which is great, but they're just kind of popping on, one by one. That's because our emission type is set to rate still. What we want to do is set that to shot, and what this is going to do is it's going to give us the option to fire particles on a certain frame. So we're going to start this we're actually going to start this on frame 0. It's going to last for 1 frame. And so what we're going to do is on frame 1, for 1 frame, we're going to shoot 1,000 particles. And what that's going to look like is this. So just with 1 shot, we suddenly have all of these particles filling up that volume. So if we play and look at it, there we go. All those particles just appear and they're just there. And you can see there's some motion to those particles, and that's because it's being affected by the turbulence modifier of our chain. And we don't want that to happen. Right now, we just want these particles just kind of hovering in air. So what we could do is we could go with our XP emitter.ambient selected, we could go into the modifiers tab, and there's this exclude and include tab. If I drag my turbulence.chain modifier into exclude, it will say ignore those, ignore that modifier. And you could also say, okay, well now they're going absolutely crazy. That's because we didn't do anything with our speed or our radius or any of those basic particle data preferences. So what I want to do is set that speed down to 1. I don't want it at 0 because I do want a tiny bit of motion. And if you look in here, you can see these are just starting to, just shifting just a little bit. Just like particles would, there'd be a little bit of like air in place. And what would be very helpful at this point is to jump back into our camera and kind of see all the confusing glory that we have. What I'm also going to do is shut off the viewport visibility of that box. No, I'm not. So just, we have those green affecting there. Okay, so this is what we're seeing in camera now. And admittedly, the size of our emitter is probably way too large. for the ultimate camera shot that we're going with. So we can play with that here, scale it to about there. Just looking at these edges here, I just want to see where it's like falling off the edges. The width of this is definitely not going to be as important, and the depth of it. So if we fire those shots, they're already a lot more dense, and we can kind of slide this into whatever position we want. Ultimately, the idea is that you want it to fill the entirety of our shot, which it is. It has a slight little motion. We're seeing the nice parallax from our camera move, but there's a few things that are still not working. So our particle size is absolutely huge. So let's follow the lead of our chain emitter, and we'll drop those particles down to 0.1. Okay, now we have some particles in air, and they're looking pretty good. What we also want to do is we want to add a lot more particles to the scene. This is looking nice. We could do that by resizing everything. We could also change the emission, and we could change the shot count. So I just added a 0 there, so now we're at 10,000 particles. There we go. Now we got a nice dusty scene. And what's great about this is we can kind of play with this until we get it to where we want. Maybe we'll try like 5,000. Yeah, something like that. It's looking pretty nice. It's looking maybe a little dense still. Maybe we'll just go to 2,000 for this one. Nice. I think this is where I kind of want it. I want it to be pretty dense, but not so dense that, if it's really dense, you'd see a lot of particles moving. But you could start to see this effect and how this is working now. As the chain is moving through it, it's almost as if it's knocking these particles off their origin point. So these green particles are really starting to show how many particles are kind of getting moved as this chain whips through this static ambient dust field. And what we could do from here is we can start to play around with the parameters. Maybe we want to increase how many particles are being displaced off there. That looks like a lot. Maybe if we drop that down to like 40, but we increase the shot of our particles to like 4,000. We take a look at that once it resets, and sure, now it's a lot denser, and you can see basically where those particles, see, like if we look like right here, it looks like those particles were already there, and they're just kind of getting knocked off of their starting point. And that's overall, that's basically what we're getting at. The last thing we could do as far as adding one more sense of like momentum going through this scene is duplicating our turbulence here. If we duplicate this turbulence, but we call this turbulence.ambient, and with this turbulence, let's switch this off again, and we'll switch off the chain emitter. If we look at turbulence.ambient, we're already seeing that kind of the frenetic kind of motion that we would want from the resulting wind of the chain whipping through. But how could we control this so it's attached to the chain? Well, the way I did it is just by building a little bit of a fall off rig for this by saying, first of all, my XP emitter.ambient, I want to look at my modifiers. By default, by adding that in there, it's going to be affecting this, but I want to go into my chain emitter, and I want to exclude my ambient turbulence from my chain because I don't want my chain particles to be affected by that second instance of turbulence. So what I could do now is if I go into my XP turbulence.ambient and I go to fall off, what I can do is add a new field. And the field I want to add is a spherical field. Now what I have is this sphere where I have a sphere where the turbulence is occurring. So the turbulence is only happening where the sphere exists. And what we're going to do now is turn our helix and cloner back on, and I'm going to jump into my right view. And what I want to happen is I want my particles to be displaced as this moves linearly through the scene. So for starters, what I'm going to do is play with my spherical field. I'm going to bring that down in size because I don't want things to really whip off of there. But you can start to see those are just kind of getting kicked off their point of origin within that field because they're being affected by the turbulence within that field. So I have that switched off, nothing's happening. I toggle it on, it starts to move. So what we can do now is with this field, I could grab the coordinates of this field and I can move this to match my chain. So I'll hit Z, hit the keyframe on Z, and I'll go to the end of this. And that is about there. We'll hit the keyframe there. We'll go into our timeline, twirl down our spherical field, position Z, and we'll make that linear as well. And now you could see that these particles are starting to get knocked off their point of origin as that chain moves through there. And if we shut this visibility off, leave. And if we switch back to our camera view, you start to see how these are moving along with it. We'll turn our XP chain emitter back on. And now we have this very complex but easy to set up system working. So I say it's very complex, it's actually not that complex. So all we're doing overall is we're building an ambient field that is being affected by the turbulence modifier only within this sphere, and we've just manually timed that with our chain. And that's it. So the final thing we really need to do is get this ready for texturing. And we're gonna have to do a few things within xparticles to do that. So what I'm gonna do is go into generators, and I'm going to choose generator, and I'm going to choose an XP generator. What this is going to do is going to generate a mesh based off of what I put into the generator and what I pointed at. So I'm going to call this first generator.ambient. And to keep the scene pretty lightweight, I'm going to grab a primitive, I'm going to grab a polygon. Polygon is very big for starters. Segment wise, I just want this to be a triangle. So I'm going to click on triangle, and I want this to be, actually the size of this doesn't matter. I just kind of want this to be in its, general shape that I want. And I'm just looking for a triangle, not a perfect one, maybe something like this. We'll jump back into our scene. And then what I could do is I could bring this polygon, rename it dust. And I'm going to drop this into my generator. And the generator, I'm going to say to use the ambient emitter as its point of generation. And as soon as we hit start, what you'll see is all of these little dots now have geometry attached to them. That's going to be very essential when we get to rendering, because we actually need something to put textures on. And there you go. You can see all these little circles are now filled with this polygon. And the reason why I said the size doesn't matter.
That's what she said.
By default, the generator scale, rotation, and offset. Scale using particle radius. You could change this. You could say source object scale, and then those are going to be huge. So that is the source object scale, because that's generating all those polygons based off that original size. But if we do particle radius, which is what it defaults as, it's going to be driven by our object, our emission, basic particle data, the radius right there. So that's why they're teeny tiny.
It's just tiny and fits right in. Fits right in.
And again, we're going to need those. We're going to need those to texture and light the scene, or else we've done all this work for nothing, at least as far as Octane goes. Additionally, what we want to do is duplicate this generator. We'll rename this one chain, and we'll go to our object, general, and change our emitter to our chain emitter. And that will help us generate particles coming off of this as well. And the material for both of these are going to be the same because it's the same dust, If you wanted to have, some sort of trail or something coming off of that, that's okay too. But that's basically it. The last thing we want to do is I want to drag that out so that will generate properly. And there we can see if we jump out of our camera once again, and we jump over to our chain. We're having a particle coming out already, and it's, you know, fitting our polygon. Beautiful. The last thing I want to do is just to add a little bit more. I want these particles to kind of sparkle in the light. So you have to set that up in your emitter. What you can do is go to the extended data tab and click on use rotation. This xparticles will have to think about this a lot more. So that's what I think that's why it's not set on by default. But now those polygons will start to rotate. And when we get into the lighting and texturing, they'll actually rotate and kind of speckle in the light. So that's the whole point of that. So now that we have all of that done, the final thing we'll do is we'll go to other objects and we'll choose object and go to XP cache.
Hello, I'm Johnny Cash.
And in our xparticles system, we have our XP cache. And what I'm going to do is just set up an xparticles cache, and I'll choose the location I want it to go to and hit build cache. What that's going to do is build a cache for my entire particle simulation. So then what I could do from now is scrub in the timeline and not have it be so bogged down while I'm texturing and lighting the scene. So we'll let this cache finish up, and then we'll move on to the next step. Thanks so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Please do comment down below. I read the comments all the time, and they do influence the content that I'm putting out for you guys, and I love the feedback. Also, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram. That's at JRMY_Walker, JRMY_WLKR. You could also reach me via email at jeremy@jeremywalker.com. That's JRMY@JRMYWLKR.com. And once again, please subscribe, ring the bell, all that kind of stuff, so that you can be a part of the next episode in the series when it is released. Thanks again so much, guys. Take care.